morning, we're going to be talking about Luke 21, and as I was thinking about this, I was trying to think of something that would tell you the story about what it's like to get ready under pressure, and it reminded me, when I was in college, I was a philosophy major, and we had to take one year-long class. It was 2 semesters, the history of philosophy, all the way from the pre-Socratics up through postmodern thought. It was a very intense class, and the tests were even more intense. So at the end of each semester, we had a 2-part exam, and the professors gave us a list of questions. I don't remember exactly how many questions. It felt like 1 million, but I think it was probably like 25, over the content from the whole semester. And you had to prepare for both a written portion and an oral defense. And the way it worked was this, like we would walk into the lecture hall, they would have 2 questions on the board, and you would have, you remember those blue booklets for essay tests? So you would pull those out, and you would just sit there and write for like an hour and a half, and then turn it in. And the oral defense part, you had to schedule an appointment with the professor. We all dressed up. We were such nerds, but we wore our philosophy major gear and went and sat in the office, and then we would take turns. You'd go back to this little conference room, and the professor would just pull questions out of an envelope, and you just had to be ready to go, like ready to answer these questions from the course material. And the last question was always any question from any part of the entire semester's worth of content. And to prepare for this, and the professors kind of told us this, they're like, feel free to form study groups and to divide up these questions and to write out essay responses and then swap them and use them to prepare. So that's exactly what we did. We had nerdy little study sessions where we quizzed each other and prepared because we wanted to be ready. It was intense, it was kind of scary, but it also was kind of exhilarating. Like you felt like, man, I'm ready for this. I remember during the written portion, the guy behind me got up at one point, went out in the hallway, went to the bathroom, threw up, and then came back and kept writing. It was just nerves. It was just anxiety. But I was like, man, that is some dedication. Okay, so I tell you this story this morning because we're talking about intense preparation and testing. And Jesus, in this moment, is trying to prepare the disciples for a season of intense testing that they are going to face. So the context for this, we've been talking about Jesus and Luke. Luke has spent 10 chapters telling us about Jesus on his way to Jerusalem. Jesus has now arrived in Jerusalem. I told you that the first 2 things that Jesus did in Jerusalem, the first was he arrived on a donkey like it was his coronation day. He arrived like a king to celebrations. And the second thing he did was he went to the temple and tore it apart because there was money-changing practices. They were selling animals for sacrifice, and Jesus objected to the way the temple was being treated. So Luke is establishing that Jesus is both a king and also that Jesus has authority over temple worship. And now Jesus, in chapter 21, is teaching in the temple here in Jerusalem during the final week before his death. And Jesus is openly confronting Jewish and Roman leadership, religious, political, and economic power. I want you to see here that Jesus is short on time. He knows the clock is ticking. He's done being subtle, and his message is direct and simple. And so my main point this morning is that we are called to stand firm and to bear testimony to Jesus. Now this chapter opens, or this story opens, with the disciples remarking about how beautiful the temple was. I kind of have a picture of a model of the temple. And the temple had just finished being rebuilt. It was still relatively a new phenomenon in the city of Jerusalem. It was this huge structure. King Herod, when he rebuilt it, doubled its size. So it was this huge marble structure. Parts of it were covered in gold. It was gleaming. You could see it for miles around. It was meant to impress. It was meant for King Herod to sort of ingratiate himself to the people of Israel, and also to show the Romans that the Jews, they weren't this backwater people, but they actually had their own culture that was worth celebrating. And so the temple was a very impressive structure, and the disciples were impressed by it. And so they're saying to Jesus, like, look at this. This is amazing. And Jesus is sort of like, like he doesn't seem that impressed. The disciples, meanwhile, are sort of falling all over themselves. But Jesus cares more about the faith of the people of God and the presence of God than he does about this religious structure and its physical beauty. In fact, Jesus tells them, as for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. Now, the disciples hear this news and they're a little concerned. They're shocked by what Jesus is saying. And they say, Teacher, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they're about to take place? Because the disciples knew that if the temple were destroyed, that would be a catastrophe for the people of Israel. Because the last time their temple got destroyed, the people of Israel were sent into exile. They were removed from their homeland. And so they're immediately thinking, if you're saying this is going to happen again, we know the ramifications for this are huge. It means the destruction of their way of life. And so they wanted to know what they should watch for, what they should be ready for, how they should prepare. Which brings me to signs of the end. Jesus said, watch out so you are not deceived. Many will come claiming, I am he, and the time is near. Don't follow them. When you hear of wars and uprisings, do not be afraid. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away. Jesus is warning them here that terrible things are going to happen, and they needed to be ready. They needed to prepare for the test. He told them to watch out and not be deceived, and he told them not to follow deceivers, and he also told them not to be afraid. He's telling them horrible things are happening. Also, don't be afraid. Jesus is thinking about this event, this catastrophe, from a different lens. He's viewing it in a different way. And he says there would be signs of the end, but the end wouldn't come right away. Now, at this point, I think it's helpful to understand some history. What is Jesus talking about? What is he predicting? When did it happen? What were the effects of that? So Jesus is he's standing there having the conversation with the disciples about the destruction of the temple as he's standing in the temple courts, roughly around 33 AD. This is when biblical scholars have kind of somewhere between 30 and 33 AD. Jesus is having this conversation with the disciples. In 66 AD, the Jewish people started an uprising against the Roman Empire. I've talked to you before about the tension between the people of Israel and the Roman Empire, and it kind of grew to a bubbling over point around 66 AD, where the Jewish people fought back against the Roman Empire. They led an armed rebellion, which led to a war. And the Roman Empire was an overwhelming force, and by 70 AD, they just came in and destroyed all of Jerusalem, including the temple, and scattered the people from the city. And so when Jerusalem was overthrown, Jews and Christians fled the city. They scattered, and they resettled throughout the Roman Empire. This is going to be important later on. During this time, many followers of Jesus faced persecution, and some were killed, some were martyred. These are the terrible things that Jesus was talking about, but he wanted to make it clear this is still not the end. So what is Jesus telling the disciples? And I think it's important to point out here, he's talking to the disciples, many of whom would give their lives for their faith in Jesus before this story was done. So Jesus is trying to prepare them. You need to be ready. You need to know how you're going to respond. You need to know the answers. Have them ready to go for when you're put on trial, for when you face this time of testimony. So that brings me to the third point, which is bear testimony to Jesus. Jesus in this moment is talking about specific events that would happen soon in the future, like within the lifetime of the people that he's talking to. But he's also talking about the end that will come at a much later date. We're still not there, but it's sometime in the future. He's saying Jerusalem would fall, but that this would not mark the end of time. He wants them to understand that because he's saying there are going to be individuals who are going to try to take advantage of the chaos by telling you this is the end of time. They're going to use it to try to get you on board and to rile you up, but don't take the bait. Don't fall for it. So during the Jewish war with Rome, some Christians may have been tempted to see these events as the beginning of the end. And Jesus is saying, don't be afraid and be able to tell the difference. Remember who I am, remember my words, and tell the difference between me and these deceivers. He said before all of this happened, some of Jesus' followers would be seized and persecuted by both Jewish and Roman authorities. They would be tested and they needed to be ready. And Jesus said, when this happens, the disciples would bear testimony to him. He told them not to worry beforehand about how they would defend themselves because he would give them the words and the wisdom that they would need in those situations. Jesus was saying the most important thing is that you continue to follow me regardless of what happens. They were to demonstrate faithfulness to God regardless of their circumstances. And by following Jesus, this means they were to continue acting like Jesus, talking like Jesus, and loving like Jesus, even when chaos was erupting all around them. Jesus is saying it's no excuse. Even when terrible things are happening, even when hard things are happening, you still need to look and sound and love like Jesus. And friends, that's a whole word for us today. Regardless of what is happening, our testimony to Jesus matters. So the question is, how is persecution an opportunity to bear witness to Jesus? Well, persecution is an opportunity to talk about the person of Jesus. And Jesus is making the point that even death does not mean the end for the faithful. Some of these folks would face martyrdom, and Jesus is saying that that's still not the end of their story. They have eternity to look forward to. But persecution is an opportunity to endure. Now, I want to be clear here about the difference between persecution and inconvenience. Persecution means being ripped from your home, having your livelihood taken from you. It means having your rights violated. It doesn't mean not having your preferences centered. There's a difference. And so in this moment, Jesus is talking to people who will face very difficult choices between maintaining their faithfulness to Jesus and choosing a path that might be easier for them. And Jesus is saying persecution becomes an opportunity for witnessing. It becomes an opportunity for testimony. Suffering is an opportunity to evangelize and spread the good news about Jesus. Now, again, here we have the benefit of looking back on history. I told you that when Jerusalem fell in 70 AD, early Christians scattered all over the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire kind of set things up nicely, not intentionally, but they created an opportunity because they protected travel. They had safe roadways. They had a common language throughout the Roman Empire. So when this happened, people scattered to other parts of the Roman Empire, and they set up little enclaves all around the Mediterranean Sea. If you look at a map of the Roman Empire, it's all around the Mediterranean Sea. They moved to these new places, and they set up little enclaves of believers, both Jewish Christians and then people who continue to practice the Jewish faith all over the Roman Empire. And guess where Paul and the other missionaries went when they went on their missionary journeys? They started with these little outposts of either Jewish Christians or groups of Jewish believers all around the Roman Empire, and that became their home base when they went talking about Jesus. So Jesus is saying, look, terrible things are going to happen. You guys are looking at the temple and you're saying, man, this thing is beautiful. This thing is going to stand for all time. And Jesus is saying, don't get distracted. It's really not that great. You know what is great? The goodness of God. And the goodness of God revealed in the person of Jesus and the work of God through Jesus on the cross and the resurrection. That's what you need to focus on. And there are going to be terrible things that are going to happen that are going to make you feel like everything is done, like the whole world is falling apart. But Jesus is seeing it through the lens of opportunity because he knows that that scattering is going to create new opportunities of new people learning about the goodness of God through the person of Jesus in these different far-flung places. So I want us to see that in this moment, Jesus cared more about his disciples maintaining their faithfulness to God than he did about the beauty of the temple. And sometimes we can be distracted by the same thing. We can be distracted by the trappings of religious practice. We can be distracted by our own security and our sense of, things continuing on as they always have. And Jesus is saying, I care more about your testimony and your persistence and your endurance and your love for God than in the safety of the city of Jerusalem. And Jesus understood that persecution can be an opportunity to stand firm and bear witness to the goodness of God and to the redemption that we have in Jesus. Testing can be an opportunity to demonstrate what we believe and who we follow and the goodness and character of God. So my main point again this morning is that we are called to stand firm and to bear testimony to Jesus. That's what we're called to do. Just like my nerdy philosophy friends and I, getting ready and being prepared so that we could give an answer when we were called upon. In the same way, Jesus is saying this is a responsibility that we have, to know who God is and to be prepared to tell about it. So for our group chat this morning, I have 2 questions for us. And as always, I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to break up into groups of 4 or 5 and answer these around your table. And you can, if you don't want to talk, that's fine, just sit and listen. But I do encourage you to try to participate. Here are the 2 questions. Why did Jesus seem unimpressed by the temple? Why was he sort of meh about it? And what was more important to Jesus than the temple? What did Jesus actually care about? And then what does it look like for us to stand firm and to bear testimony to Jesus? What can this look like for us? And I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. Go ahead and talk around your tables, and then I'll bring us back together. All right. I hope you guys had a great conversation here. Love giving you guys, sometimes it's very clear to me that you guys know lots too, and it's really good for you to get a chance to talk about it. I hope that helps you remember it a little bit better. This morning, I want us to think about what it looks like for us to stand firm and bear testimony to Jesus. And one of the things I try to talk about or convey is the importance of knowing Jesus, being able to know and name the character of Jesus, the goodness of Jesus, and to know that so thoroughly, to understand how God feels about us, and this is what helps us be prepared to answer these kinds of questions, and to stand firm and to point to Jesus. So Jesus is telling the disciples to get ready for the most intense testing process they would ever face. They had to know what they believed inside and out, so they could be ready. And Jesus promised that the Spirit would be available to them with the words and the wisdom that they needed in the moments that they needed them. And their job was to stand firm and bear testimony for Jesus. And the same is true for us. In so many of these things, Jesus is saying you will be supplied with what you need. Your job is to not give up. Your job is to stand firm and to remember the hope that you have and to testify to it. So that's our hope this morning. It's not in buildings or structures. It's not in religious practices. It's in the person of Jesus, and it's in the love of God that we serve.